You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther, Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss the recent crackdown on abusive Islamic schools in Nigeria. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also follow my Twitter handle, send your comments, send your thoughts to my Twitter handle. It's at Esther O. Awoniyi. Now, in recent weeks, just over 1,000 people have been freed from raids on abusive religious schools in northern Nigeria. The captives were mostly shackled males ranging from 7 years to 40 who have been kept in inhumane and degrading circumstances. Nigeria's president has called for a crackdown of such establishments. Alexis Akwagyiram, Reuters Bureau Chief for Nigeria, joins me to discuss this developing story. Alexis, thank you for your time today. Now, you've been covering this story and you've also been on the ground, just seeing how this has been evolving and basically developing. Help bring us up to speed on perhaps just take a few steps back, how this all began. I understand that there have been 4 raids so far, 4 rescue situations or missions, if you will, but just let's start from there.
Okay, so this came to light. The first raid was in late September, and that was in Kaduna.
Okay.
And that came about because the uncle of some boys he came to a school and he went to go and visit them. He didn't enter them into the school and he wasn't allowed to see them. So he went to the police. He was obviously a man of great standing in the community. And when he went with the police, he saw the conditions in which boys and young men were being held, and the police raided the facility. And then after that, there was controversy, this is in late September, about the condition. There were around 400 boys and young men, and they had been shackled, they'd been whipped, there had marks on where they'd been whipped, and many of them said that they'd been sexually abused. In the wake of that, the presidency said this was unacceptable, and said that any such facilities had to be raided. And so the police across the northwest have gone out, and then subsequently there have been a number of raids in Katsina and also more recently in Kaduna.
So subsequent raids came as a result of the presidency saying perhaps there are more of these situations, so let's go out and see what else is happening.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
But just the conditions under which being on the ground under which these facilities, these children are. I know some of them are up to the age of 40. These individuals were being held. Help us understand, because what we understand is that they're being taught under the Quranic religious education system. So, but then what we also heard is that, it wasn't just that, it was also correctional, like some juvenile delinquency center or something. So just help us understand, were you able to make a distinction between those who were there for education or were there for correctional purposes, or it was just a mix of both?
It was a mix of both. Ultimately, this is a real grey area. It's very sensitive, obviously, because of the role of religion in this. But ultimately, we spoke to parents. Obviously, I went there. I was on the ground in Kaduna with the first raid. And when I spoke to parents, I would typically get one of 2 answers. They either said, I paid for my child to go to school and to receive a good education and learn to recite the Quran. Others would say, I use this as a correctional facility and I paid to use it as a correctional facility because my child, maybe a wayward teenager, has been a delinquent in some way. They haven't gone to school, they're misbehaving, and I wanted them to be corrected. And as part of that, they would receive discipline and also learn about the Quran as well.
Now, even more disturbing because, we heard that many of them were in chains, shackled, and there was sexual abuse, stories. And I think the one on Saturday, the latest on Saturday, about 22 females also found. Did that put a different spin on the story? Because usually it's the boys, it's the men, it's a facility for men who are learning the Al-Majri education system and, even there for discipline. But how did that change things?
Yeah, that was a different dynamic altogether. That was completely unexpected because up until this point, we're looking at 4 raids over the course of the last month and around 1,000 people having been freed. And out of those 1,000, as you say, all of a sudden there were some women thrown in. We're still trying to establish the details as to what happened there, why the women were there, how this differed. Because again, there are conflicting reports coming out. There were details that we've come across about there being 2 separate buildings, and one was for education and one was for corrections side by side. And there was some overlap. So for example, if you were in the education building,
okay,
and misbehaved, then you would be sent over to building number 2 for discipline of some sort. Where the women come into it, the females, that is not yet immediately clear. But I mean, that was peculiar in a very strange story anyway.
Now, did you get the opportunity to talk to the heads of these schools, I think the malams that they're called or whatever, in terms of, I mean, what the thinking was, if there was a curricula, what the system was about, and in what place correction came in, discipline, and how they mixed that all up with education, just to get a sense of how they were run in place?
I mean, the short answer to that is no, because in the first case in Kaduna, that Malam was quickly arrested, as were members of his staff. And then again in Katsina, we haven't spoken to them. However, we have spoken to people who worked there, who worked in some of these facilities, and also to members of the community, people who sent their children, people who were involved intimately. So, for example, a cook in one of these places who said she worked there, she saw what was going on. She was not perturbed by what she saw, and she said that these reports have been overblown. For the most part, what they say is they needed to be shackled, to be disciplined, and to stop them trying to escape. In many instances, both people that worked there and also parents said the whole point was just to teach them discipline, to teach them an appreciation of the religion and the Quran specifically. And the idea would be that they would receive that Quranic education, but they would have to learn discipline as the bedrock of everything that they did in their life, and that it would be good for them. And that ultimately they would be freed from this facility, be it a school or correctional facility, and then they would go out and it would be good for them. So that's the thinking. In terms of the way in which the day was split up, I mean, certainly in the Kaduna case, what I was told by many children and people that worked there was that, well, they were locked up for the vast majority of the day, and then occasionally they would get a break in which they would recite the Quran. They would stay up late into the night, and then they would get maybe 3 hours of sleep from the hours of, say, around 10 to 1 in the morning, and then they would be woken up to recite the Quran and to recite the Quran for a number of hours, and then there would be prayers, and then they would be shackled again.
So, from a community perspective, did you get the sense, because I get a sense that, I mean, obviously this was all in plain sight, and perhaps the community, or some of the communities didn't see anything wrong in it. They didn't think it was, something to make any noise about. Did you get that sense that, it was until when the police came that people now decided to say, oh, well, maybe some things went wrong in there, but, from a general perspective, I mean, if a child is set or deemed to be wayward or whatever, needs some discipline, that would be the place to go. And of course, stop them from escaping. Of course, put them in shackles. So did you get a sense from a community perspective that that was an acceptable practice and they just didn't see anything wrong in it until an outsider came and said, oh no, this is just not it? Absolutely.
Yes. I mean, it was definitely and is definitely deemed to be acceptable to have them shackled from a large swathe of the population, a large swathe of the people that we spoke to. And we were very thorough. We speak to lots and lots of people when we're on the ground to make sure we get a really good sense of what people are saying and thinking. And for the most part, people were fine with that. Now, that doesn't mean that they were fine with everything.
What aspects of those situations were they not okay with?
Sexual abuse. I mean, nobody that we spoke to signed up for their child to be abused sexually, and people were generally shocked by that. In terms of the shackling, they were fine with. Opinions varied on the extent of the beatings and the whippings. But I mean, I can give you examples. I mean, one anecdote, there was a boy I spoke to, and he was 17, and he'd been in the facility for 7 years. And when he first went there, he escaped, and he got back home. And they brought him back, and then they, at the facility, they hung him up from a wall by his arms, and he broke various bones in both shoulders. And to this day, he can barely lift his arms. He can't lift them beyond this point. So he was sent home for 6 months to convalesce, and he got better. And when he got better, his family sent him back. Now, presumably, they did so in full knowledge of the discipline that was meted out to him. So there is an understanding, but there is understanding. The area in which there is some confusion or differences of opinion might be in, say, the age. So, for example, I saw children who were as young as 5 years old, and they had beatings, the marks of being whipped. Now, with that, the parents were visibly distressed.
They didn't expect that extent of discipline, as it were. But were there stories of parents who had heard these stories and said, oh, wow, I have to go get my children out from the other? Because obviously just a handful of centers have been raided so far, and obviously there's a possibility that there's so many more of them out there. So were there stories of parents saying, oh, we need to go get our children out from the others that have not been raided by the police? Did any of that come up?
That's a very good question, Esther. To be honest with you, we haven't got a sense of that yet, but that could be because we weren't asking those questions. Okay. Because we were very much focusing on the situation on the ground with the centres that are being raided and the reasons behind it, the malams involved, and the role played by the state in this, as well as the police.
Now let's talk about the response of the authorities, the government. The presidency obviously put out a statement talking about obviously condemning the situation, talking about the fact that these children, especially referring to the younger ones, that they should obviously be in school having basic, regular, conventional education, and obviously condemned it, like I said. And then before now, President Buhari had actually also talked about reviewing, as it were, but there was talk about banning, but he, of course, his media aides came out and quickly said, no, the president has not said there's no immediate ban, but the objective is that perhaps in the long term, we could see that happening. But in the meantime, obviously, there have been several calls for these type of schools to be regulated. Just share your thoughts on how that you see that conversation has progressed in terms of how these schools can be regulated or should be regulated, if that is a conversation you think is gaining momentum.
Well, the presidency's language on this has been very nuanced. It's been treading very carefully. So on the Ahmadiyya school system, absolutely, as you say, in June, there were a slew of media reports suggesting that they were maybe going to be closed, and it was clear from the presidency that that's an aspiration, but there was no time frame given. However, I would say that they've made it very clear in the statements that they put out with regards to these various raids that they see them more as correctional facilities rather than schools. Now, the difficulty there, I suppose, is that many of these children are of school age. So, as you rightly pointed out, there are people as old as 40. And there are teenagers who might not be in school, but there are also very, very young children. That is not a point that has necessarily been addressed by the presidency, and the presidency has chosen to focus on the correctional facility side of this, because as far as they're concerned, that's what they're dealing with here. These are rehabilitation centres which have gone from discipline into abuse.
Alexis, we'll just take a break here. Thank you so much for your time so far. We'll come back and continue from where we left off. Okay, so if you're just joining me, Alexis Akwagyiram, Reuters Bureau Chief for Nigeria, is my guest today on Beyond Market, and we're discussing the recent crackdown on abusive religious schools in northern Nigeria. Thank you, Alexis, for your time so far. Let's pick up from where we left off. Obviously, we've established that for many of these schools, it was part correctional, part education, but in the Al-Majiri system of education. But I guess that also speaks to the broader question of, do we, in some of the states where these facilities were raided, were there or are there proper formal correctional centers serving, maybe established to serve that same purpose? Did that conversation come up in terms of the government says, okay, fine, we're taking these people away from these schools, and I don't know if they would establish that, perhaps take them back to their parents, or do we pick it from there? But just general conversations around formal correctional centers in these states.
So that's absolutely a conversation that we are having. We're asking those questions of officials. Now, from the initial reporting we've done, the sense that we get is that these centres are filling a gap in these communities because in the absence of formal state institutions, many parents or families believe that this is a viable way and an economically viable way for them to deal with.
Well, they think it's cheaper, and you say economically viable.
Yeah, no, they believe it's cheaper. They believe it's good value in the long run. They think it's something that's well worth doing. Certainly, there are questions that we are asking of the officials, of government officials, both at a state and national level, federal level, because we want to be clear, well, what is this? But certainly, anecdotally on the ground, this is what communities are saying. They're saying, well, we need something, and there must be a gap between being at school and being in prison. And
like usual juvenile delinquency centers. I mean, I thought we used to have those. But anyways, for these individuals who have been rescued from these centers, especially the children, I mean, did you talk to officials in terms of what their plans are, where they're holding them, and how they're going to be rehabilitated, and what's going to happen from there?
For the most part, the official line is these children are going to be reunited with their parents. It's up to the parents to help them. They will provide support. They will, the officials say they will follow up and work on trying to get these children into a formal education system. But it is ultimately the responsibility of the parents. And if the parents wish to pursue another course of action, then they can do that.
But I suppose, I mean, that other course of action, I suppose, I mean, if that gap remains in terms of the states not having the official or formal correctional centers, I'm thinking that cycle is going to continue, because when the government and the cameras and everybody leaves, I mean, those parents who feel like they're stuck with these children that they feel still require discipline. So do you expect that perhaps that cycle could continue? Because if that gap remains in terms of the government coming to provide the correctional centers for these parents, and there isn't any, I'm just thinking that could continue, and we could have this problem on our hands continuing again.
We could do. I mean, I'm not a soothsayer, but however, I mean, I can't see how the cycle will stop instantly. I mean, it looks like there would need to be some form of reforms, or work in the education system, or some kind of change. And even then, it will take time, I imagine, because of the size of the population in a number of these northern states where this has been happening.
Speaking about population, we've had a lot of conversations about Nigeria's out-of-school children. I believe we have the highest in the world. And what statistics tell us is that about 8 million or so are in 10 of these northern states. So I'm thinking that this also sheds, throws more spotlight on our out-of-school children narrative and conversation. Do you think that this puts more pressure on the government? Because if we're talking about it, I mean, this is some sort of because many people didn't know that these children, some as young as 5, were not receiving formal education. And many of these states accepted the fact that these Quranic or these Al-Majiri schools were sort of being accepted as the formal education for, children, in toddlers, if you were. I'm just wondering, does that put more pressure? Do you think that puts more pressure on the government to do more in terms of, changing that narrative of its out-of-school children?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure it does. I mean, which is counterintuitive, because you would assume that, yes, this does put pressure on them. But then pressure from who is the question I would ask, because the communities where this has been happening, the communities know about these facilities, and they're the ones who, in many cases, entered their children and their young men into these facilities. The IMF, the likes of the World Bank, they're the people who put together these statistics. They know the extent of this problem. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're putting extra pressure on. And the government themselves knew. I mean, these numbers are well known. So I'm not sure, and the government has worked to try and get ahead of this and say, look, this is a situation about correctional facilities. So I've not come across a lot of political pressure on the government. And the government have been very strict and said, this is unacceptable. They've said that. So,
but do you think, I mean, it might come across to some people as just, rhetoric, because it is a sensitive subject. And at some point, it could actually also get political because it's religious. And you know how those two work sometimes in Nigeria. So do you think that the government is torn between that, trying to come across as, yes, sensitive enough to the situation, but at the same time also sensitive to aspects of, the way the country is structured, the north religion in the north versus etc. Do you think that is also a pressure for the government?
I think there are various sources of pressure. I mean, it can be tricky. It can be very tricky. And also, what it has done is shone a light on the extent of the challenges, because these numbers were well known. The likes of something between 8 and 10 million children out of school. The numbers are well known. What this has done is actually shown the world pictures about what can happen. Because people who've gone to some of these states will see children begging on the streets, who are poorly clothed, children who should be in school. But that's something that stayed very much within those states and within the country, but now people around the world will have seen repeatedly these images of boys and young men in chains, and that is something that may push the government to think about this and think, well, we have to address this. But there are so many challenges to deal with, because the rate of population growth in Nigeria generally is huge, and then specifically in the north is growing at a faster rate than other parts of the country. I mean, in large part that's due to them having larger families, multiple wives sometimes, or just being subsistence farmers and having larger families because of that. So it's difficult.
Now, for you as a journalist tracking this story and also being on the ground, just thinking forward now, have the police talked about any future raids coming? Do they have any leads in terms of where they're going to go next, and what could happen, and if they're trying to widen their net?
The police have been very, very clear on this in the various states that we've been to, specifically in Kaduna and in Katsina. What they've said is they're going to go out and cast a very wide net, and they are going to go pretty much door to door, and they are going to raid as many of these as they can. And you can see that there's been momentum. I mean, even in the last week alone, there have been multiple raids. So they've been very clear on that. I mean, the interesting thing in all of this, and we've spoken about this, but it's a crucial thing, is that this is not a surprise to people locally. When you speak to locals, they know about the facilities. They don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the day-to-day curriculum, as it were, or the timetable for
or if the students ever even graduate from the school in the first place.
Exactly. They don't necessarily know the specifics of any of this, but they do know they exist. So if you take that knowledge and you combine it with a very strict order from the presidency to deal with this and to raid these places, well, then it makes sense that they will actually act on this.
Would it be fair to say, obviously, I mean, neither you or me could know the extent of how this could play out, but do you think that with all this spotlight that's come to these schools, even before we do have perhaps some kind of formal, structured regulation of these schools, the fact that there's been this kind of spotlight and the response of the government, that we could actually begin to see some kind of change in terms of how these schools, how the systems in these schools are run? Or do you I don't know, maybe that's just me being hopeful here.
I mean, we could, as you say, neither of us actually know, but we could. I mean, you could see that the government is in a position to make a very strong case, because I imagine few people would say that they want more children to be locked up and in the worst case scenario, subjected to sexual abuse. So it's an opportunity. It certainly does present an opportunity for reform. We don't know whether that opportunity will be taken or not.
Now, for you, I think we have about 3 minutes left. For you, what would you say? I mean, for you, being on the ground and covering such a story as this, what would you say were aspects of the story that you found maybe most intriguing, or just key takeaways for you from this story compared to kind of perhaps similar stories that you've covered in the past?
I mean, with this story, probably more than any story I've ever reported, it's a matter of the separation of my head and my heart. So with my head, it's a striking illustration of the impact of population growth and the role of education. And those, you can see the factors that have led to this without making a moral judgment. In terms of the heart, it's the most unpleasant, upsetting, visceral story I've ever reported on, because when you see these children and they tell you what happened and they're covered in these marks and these beatings.
Did some of them say that they just wanted to go home?
Yes.
Talking to them?
Many of the children, they just wanted to go home. And then the upsetting thing is, well, maybe they'll go home, but they might not have been corrected, as it were, to the extent that their parents wanted to. They might be sent to another facility. I remember speaking to people in a crowd who were protesting about the presence of the police, and we asked, are there others?
They were protesting the presence of the police?
Yeah, and they said, well, where are we going to send these children? And then one middle-aged gentleman said, well, I asked him, are there others? He said, yeah, there are others. I mean, there's one down there and there's one somewhere else. So those are the takeaways that I took from this.
Thank you, Alexis, for your time today. It's a pleasure having you on the show. I've been speaking to Alexis Akwagyiram, who's the Reuters Bureau Chief for Nigeria, and that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and of course, you can send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. For myself and the team, it's bye for now.